camera. I'm on this crazy screen. Are they the one that goes to the center of your screen? You seen one of those?
There are some like that. Yeah. I mean, they're going to block part of your screen definitionally and do
My face will be just fine, but
well, but I mean, some cameras already know how to kind of adjust because they recognize that they're at the top of the screen and that you're going to be lower down.
Yeah, my camera comes with a little piece of software that lets me, right? Like this is what it looks like with the main view of my camera, and then it's got a little software that I can click in. And
I probably either don't know how to do that, or my camera is probably not that kind of camera. But
Carney, your mom says hi.
Oh, she does? I haven't seen her in a while. No, we've been being tested because we were away and we were waiting for PCR results. And are you guys getting the same crazy COVID numbers that we're seeing?
Jim, you're back to virtual also, right? Did I see that?
Partially virtual and partially in person.
Well, hopefully everyone is staying safe and welcome. We're glad to be spending this, what I feel is a very cold Tuesday afternoon, with all of you. So welcome. I'm assuming most of you, like this feels kind of old hat, but we're excited to be joining all of you. As just a reminder. So I'm Maharat Rory Picker-Nice. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's hard for everyone to say the word old hat when you have such a nice hat on. Is that a new hat?
Thank you. It's not a new hat, but
okay, look, a very nice hat.
I do appreciate that. So I'm joined today, that was Rabbi Carney Rose of Congregation B'nai Emunah, and Rabbi Daniel Bogard from Central Reform Congregation, and Rabbi Jim Bennett from Congregation Sher Emeth. I know sometimes we don't always say where we all are, and we're just thrilled to get to share some study and some Torah with all of you, and growing out of the work and the study that we've all done together through the Hartman Institute, but continuing to expand and grow and veer into new directions. So a couple of quick housekeeping. The chat is available. There's also the Q&A, so you can feel free. It's always amusing for us to get to see and hear through reading some of your reactions and responses, and we do try to interact and respond as much as possible. Usually I'll say for me when I'm not the one that's speaking, because multitasking gets harder and harder. Autumn is here and is available for any tech support, so you can chat them directly and they are available to help. All of these are recorded and available afterwards, and there is live transcript available if you click that option at the bottom of your screen. I think that was all the housekeeping pieces. And so today we're going to be talking about God, which is, lighthearted, simple topic. So Carney, you're the one who kind of pushed us here, but I'm going to start us off. We're going to go somewhat in order of the text that we've selected. So I have some Talmudic texts. So my texts are the earliest, although not necessarily because these ideas are going to be all that varied in terms of age. But what I want to do, so I'm just going to kind of start off by saying that for me, like in talking about God, I find God to be so impossible to find and so impossible to constrain, which is part of what I love about the concept of God, right? That it is a concept that is like beyond definition and beyond comprehension, right? That our idea of God has to be bigger than any one simple idea or any one box that we could put God into. And I think that the rabbis kind of reflect that also. So that's what I want to share today. So I want to do a little bit of study, and let me share my screen. Okay, how's that? You're good? We're good? Okay, so, well, this is a picture. So I wanted to give a little bit of background because what I want to talk about today is a man named Elisha ben Avuya, who the rabbis call Acher. He's called Acher, the other, because he is like the original, like he who shall not be named, the absolute one that you're never supposed to, right? His name gets erased from the canon. He's called the other. And the rabbis go about telling all of these stories. Acher really scares the rabbis more than I think any other person, in part because he's one of them. He's one of the greatest sages of his generation. And he is famously, for those of you who know the story of Pardes, of the orchard, right? Four go into the orchard. Acher is one of them. Rabbi Akiva is the one who comes out unscathed. If you don't know that story, don't worry about it. That's a whole other path to go down. And the rabbis, basically, they tell story after story about Acher to kind of describe like how much he's gone off the path, right? So he, first of all, like it's decreed from heaven that everyone can return except for Acher, which is, again, has all these other questions in terms of whether or not we can, the possibilities of redemption. But Acher, at that point, he breaks Shabbat, he uproots a plant on Shabbat, he goes to a sex worker, he rides, this picture here, he's riding a horse, which already for the rabbis, like rabbis tend to ride donkeys, like the Greeks and the elite ride horses, rabbis ride donkeys, right? He rides his horse, and he rides his horse past the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, that is Shabbat, right? Acher is like as far afield as you can possibly go for the rabbis. And then in the course of telling all these stories, I mean, so much so that in some versions of the stories, he even starts murdering children. I mean, it gets to be incredibly extreme. And then we get to this story. So all these stories are in Tractate Chagiga. We get to this story, and that's going to be a few generations later. So Ishkechei Rabba Bar Shela Le'Eliyahu. So I already love this, right? The rabbis, like, randomly will stumble upon Elijah in the marketplace. This just happens to rabbis not so infrequently. So Rabba Bar Shela, like,
I was at Schnucks this morning, and I think Elijah was there.
Yeah. Did you talk to him, or was he busy?
He was quite busy. He was ordering fish. So.
Carney, have you seen? Jim Goodman writes a whole genre of poems about the prophets he meets at Schnucks.
Oh, yeah. Okay. He brought his own knife.
I just want to add that when I saw him there, I took a long look into his shopping cart to see what he was purchasing. I just wanted to be able to report that.
Okay.
So excellent. So Rabba Bar Shela, he bumps into Elijah, and he starts chatting with him. Unlike Carney, who leaves him alone, right? He starts chatting with him, and he says to Elijah the question that all of us would, should we talk to Elijah, ask Elijah, where he says, Maika Avid HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, like, what's the Holy One up to right now? Like, what's God doing? Amar le ka'amar shmata mi Pumayhu dekulu Rabbanan umipume Rabbi Meir lo ka'amar. So he says to him, Elijah answers Rabbi Bar Shela, and he says, God is reciting teachings in the name of all of the rabbis, except for the name of Rabbi Meir. Okay, so immediately, like, you have to love this, because God is doing exactly what, like, every good Jewish person is supposed to be doing right now, which is studying Torah. God is studying Torah, and God is studying the Torah of the rabbis, right? Because that's what we all are supposed to study, Talmud, right? So God is studying Torah, and God is citing Torah in the name of all the rabbis, except for the name of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Bar Shela asks Elijah, why? Why would God not be studying the Torah of Rabbi Meir? And Elijah answers him, because he learned it from the mouth of Acher. Because Rabbi Meir was a student of Acher, and therefore God rejects Acher, and God is not going to study the Torah of Rabbi Meir, who learned it from Acher. Rabbi Bar Shela challenges Elijah, which again is like just exactly what you should do with Elijah whenever you meet him. Rabbi Bar Shela says, why? And this is like maybe one of my favorite lines. He says, Rabbi Meir rimon matzah tochu achal klipato zara. Rabbi Meir found a pomegranate, he ate the fruit, and he threw away the peel. Look, like, Rabbi Meir is a great rabbi, and he takes the good and he throws away the bad. Okay, so immediately afterwards, Amar le, so Elijah says to Rabbi Bar Shela, he says, Hashtaka Amar, now God is saying, Meir b'ni omer, Meir, my son, says, Bizman she'adam mitza'er shchina ma lashon omeret, kalani meroshi, kalani mizro'i. When a person is suffering, what does the Shekhinah, the divine presence, say? My head is heavy, my head is hurting, my arm is heavy. And if the Holy One, blessed be God, is grieved over the blood of the wicked, how much more so over the blood of the righteous that's shed? So he's going to quote this teaching. God is going to quote this teaching. So sorry, Elijah is quoting God, quoting this teaching. So first of all, right, there's like this amazing element of what's happening, right? Rabbah bar Shela challenges Elijah. God is like listening in on this conversation. Rabbah bar Shela wins the argument. God likes this, right? Rabbi Meir. And so God immediately quotes a teaching in that moment of Rabbi Meir. And I won't necessarily go into all of it, but I did bring the source of this teaching. So actually, this comes from the Mishnah in Sanhedrin. The backdrop to it is that this is talking about how one does capital punishment. That's the context that this is talking about, what to do when somebody is supposed to be stoned to death. And so we have this teaching of Rabbi Yossi, who says that you have a post that leans against the wall, and after a person is stoned, their corpse is hung. And he hangs the corpse on it the way that butchers do. So this is supposed to be like discarded, just like meat, right? And then they immediately untie him. And if he's left hanging overnight, a prohibition is transgressed. As it is stated, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him that day, for he that is hung is a curse of God. This comes from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. So the Beit Din, the court, would hang the corpse, but not for a very long period of time and not overnight. That is to say, were the corpse left hanging on the tree overnight, people would ask, why is that one hung? Like, why was this person put to death? And it says the response would be because he blessed God, which is a euphemism. We don't say that someone curses God, someone blasphemes. We use the language of Beirachat Hashem, that they blessed the name. And therefore, the name of heaven would be desecrated because people would keep talking about this blasphemy, and we would keep reminding each other that someone blasphemed God, which would then be desecrating the name of God. And then the next Mishnah, Rabbi Meir kind of argues with this. He says, no, it's when it says that he that's hung is a curse of God, it's actually understood differently. He says, why is it a curse to God? Because when a man suffers, what expression does the divine presence use? I'm distressed about my head. I'm distressed about my arm. If God suffers the blood of the wicked that's spilled, it can be inferred a fortiori over the blood of the righteous, right? All the more so the blood of the righteous. And the sages said not only this, but anyone who leaves his deceased overnight transgresses a prohibition. If he left him overnight for the sake of the deceased's honor, like to get a coffin or shrouds, he does not transgress. And they would not bury him. This is going back to the person who was stoned to death. They would not bury him in his ancestral plot. Rather, 2 graveyards were established by the court, one for those who were killed by decapitation or strangled, and one for those who were stoned or burned. So this isn't like the most fun or like uplifting of teachings that gets quoted here. I'm going to stop sharing so we can kind of see, right? But what's like amazing to me in all of this is that, right? So this is the teaching that God quotes. God quotes Rabbi Meir here. So God is studying texts about capital punishment, like based off of like the rabbi's teachings, but ultimately also the text that God quotes from Rabbi Meir is a text about God. Right? It's not just like this legal text, right? What's the quote that he quotes from Rabbi Meir is saying, what is God doing in the moment that this person is put to death, right? And it's God being grieved over the death of any one of God's creation. And so to me, like this is just, I don't know if I quite have the words to totally capture, and there's something sort of circuitous and like it bends my mind in a way that I think is really great when we start talking about God, because I don't think we're supposed to be able to totally comprehend where God is or how God operates. But this idea that in the rabbinic imagination in the Talmud, right, first of all, they don't have philosophical conversations about God. They have legal conversations. And through the legal conversations, we're trying to get God. That's why I always think when people say, like Judaism's too overly legalistic, I think there's something that they're missing, because we talk about laws, but when we talk about laws, we're really trying to understand what's the meaning of life, right? Like that's what we mean when we start talking about all of this. But that in the rabbinic mind, they're not sure kind of how to understand God, and God's not even totally sure how to understand God, right? Like God is also studying their studying of God, and this idea that, first of all, I think there's something so incredibly poetic about kind of shattering this idea that like even God is sort of trying to quote what Rabbi Meir thinks about God, is just already like can just kind of make your head explode, and also that that in many ways, right, like the best way that we can access God is by understanding one another, right? Is through the interactions, right? That like what is God doing? God is doing what any of us would be doing, right? God is grieving. God is grieving over all, right? God is the best way kind of for God to also understand who God is through relationship with humanity. And that it's like through this engagement that God also becomes realized and manifest in the world. And I don't know if I have the words that are quite as eloquent as I'm sure we'll get to more so like when we get to people like Heschel or all of the others, right, who are, I think more of you brought like kind of the philosophers to it, but I'm just so struck that like even the rabbis in their most basic element of trying to understand what is it that God has called us and what are the laws are really wrestling with these questions in the most beautiful of ways and recognizing that in some ways I think what they come to, and I think for me also what I often come to is just this realization that we can spend all day and night questioning these deep questions that we'll never come to an answer about, right? Ultimately, like until, I don't know, maybe there is some future day or some later world where we get to know the answers, but whatever it is that my answer is, right? If I think God wants me to drive a car or not drive a car or turn left or turn right or whatever it is, right? Like there's no bolt of lightning that's going to tell me the answer immediately. And so the best thing that I can access is this world and access the ways that we treat one another. And that in this, right, the ways that we're ultimately accessing God is how do we give the greatest dignity even to the worst offenders of people that we could possibly imagine. That even to the person who would blaspheme God, who would violate the very core of the laws that have been established, who needs to be put to death by a court, which happens so incredibly rarely, and the most grievous of offenses of then hanging this body, that we still take it down immediately and that we still talk about how we can care for God's creation because that's our best way to access God. And that's the way that God is also accessing God, and God is accessing God through God's own creation as well. Anyway, I think I can keep talking in circles because this makes my brain go in circles, but I welcome any of your thoughts or responses or reactions.
By the way, there are some questions, one for you in particular, Maharat Rory, from Rudy Nissenboim. Can you see the question? I'll ask the question. I thought we Jews don't know Adonai because we are still waiting. I assume that means still waiting to understand God. Do you want to address that issue, Rory?
So I don't, first of all, I'm curious like to hear what everyone maybe has to say about it, but I don't know that there's like a specific thing that we're waiting for. I think that the rabbis sometimes imagine just because this world is so complex that like one day there's going to be a point where everything will be revealed. I don't know. I don't know if it is. But I think that's exactly the point, that I think we don't know. That's ultimately, I think, what the rabbis are also saying, right? And like, who is God for them? God is one of the rabbis. Right? Like God is doing the same thing that they do every day, right? God studies Torah just like they study Torah. So I also think, I don't know, somebody once told me, I've never actually seen this in the original, so I shouldn't quote it, but there was like a Yiddish proverb. Everything sounds like a Yiddish proverb, right? That it said like the God of a triangle would have three sides. Right? Just this idea that like we all create God in our, like, we're created in God's image, but we've also created God in our image. And so if that's the case, then the truth is that the best way to access God, right? The problem that we often face is that we're willing to harm people in our pursuit of God. And what this is saying is that you can't do that, right? If you're going to harm a person in the pursuit of God, then you violated God. Ultimately, the best way to God is through other people.
Right. God is like us, only more so on some level, right?
Maybe
Yeah.
to just add to your answer to Rudy's question, it may be that Rudy is referring less to God and more to the Jewish concept of Mashiach, of Messiah, where often people will clarify one of the differences between Jewish views of Messiah and other faiths, in particular Christianity, by saying that in our case, we don't understand Mashiach because we are still waiting for Mashiach, at least in a literal sense, in contrast to other faiths, Christianity in particular, where there's an idea of Mashiach, of the Messiah having already appeared and become known to humanity. So I'm wondering if that's where Rudy's confusion may emanate from.
Yeah, Rudy does say that. Yes, Jim, I am. That was helpful.
So, Rory, I have a question for you. I
Okay.
love this teaching. I love this text. Really one of my favorite sugyas, though I have never honed in on this part. I thought we were going to tell the horse part. I thought that's where, but I love the image. So I guess my question is more personal for you, if you're up for it, which is,
Sure.
do you believe in a personal God that you can be in relationship with, that responds to prayers, that is movable and changeable in that sense?
The easy and hard answer is that I'm not totally sure, in the sense that like I do, I mean, like I believe in God. I think there's something really egotistical about a personal God, right? The idea that like I can move God. I believe in a God that I think has, let me say this a little differently. I see the story of Tanakh as a story of God as a parent who continues to give more and more distance to people, not as an absent, right? But like, I think like early on, right, it's like very like, hold your hand, and we need to keep you away from burning yourself in the fire, and you're going to make a mistake, and I'm going to fix this, and I'm going to restart it for you. And then over time, it's like, I've taught you all the lessons, and all I can do is just kind of step back and let you make your own mistakes at this point. And like, right, there's still those points where it's like, okay, you screwed up and I can lend you some money, but now I want you to pay it back. And then there's the like, you have to live the life that you've built for yourself. And I think that's where we are. I think we're at like the post-college, like we've all grown up, and now we're in our 40s, and God is like, you can call me anytime and I'm willing to chat, but like I gave you all the pieces that you need. And I think that's also very much like, for me, I'm very highly influenced by particularly like the Holocaust, post-Holocaust theologians. And I think it might be, I'm going to misquote, like it might be Fackenheim or, but I can't remember now exactly, but like the classic question of where is God at Auschwitz? And for me, like the answer that I think is most compelling is like this, right? It's God is there weeping, saying, why aren't you all stopping this? Like I gave you, like humanity could have stopped that, right? Like that wasn't a God choice, right? Like that's a humanity choice. And I also think that it erases free will to say like, God wanted that to happen. Like there were people who made the decision to build Auschwitz, right? Like that is how that happens. And the same way, by the way, right now, like I don't think that COVID's not going to end because God's going to decide to metaphorically snap fingers, right? Like God is like, I gave you science, and I gave you scientists, and I gave you wisdom, and I gave you like, and over time, like you've used it and you've built all of these machines, and right. And now like we have vaccines and we have testing. And it's humanity that's choosing through policy and through our own stubbornness, maybe not outright, but like through our own stubbornness, like all of these things, right? Like the fact that people are suffering right now is a policy choice, right? Like we know how to produce enough food to feed every person in the globe, but we choose not to. So like that to me is not going to that's not a matter of prayer. So like I very much do believe in God and in this relationship and this ability to like talk through kind of like what I was describing with like a parent, and sort of ask for advice and ask for guidance. And I find prayer to be something that's very centering for me. And I do find in times of crisis, like turning to God is always, right? Like when you're waiting for like test results or like really scary moments, I certainly do that also. But I don't think that the whole world, like I don't believe in a God that intervenes in nature. And I don't like I don't, not because I think God can't, but because I think that's the world that God created. I think God created a world where God then not stepped out, but like is like, I'm not going to save you. I'm not going to keep giving you this loan. And I very much believe that like God has given us everything we need in this world, and that it's basically up to us to figure it out.
Daniel, would you be willing to take a crack at your own question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the answer for me is I don't believe in a God that is personal or intervenes or acts. Jim's going to teach some Maimonides in a couple minutes. I never had a God language that felt authentic to me and authentically Jewish until I really understood Rambam. And that really took until Hartman for me. I managed to make it all the way through rabbinical school without having Well, I think some folks are sometimes surprised by how little we talk about God at all in rabbinical school, ever. Certainly not dealing with our own personal faith or beliefs. But yeah, no, I don't believe in a God that changes or moves or acts or is a person in any way. And the closest I get to a definition of God, and I understand this very Maimonidean, is that God is the word we use for the capital T truth of the universe. And in a very postmodern way, since we are in the system, we can never hold absolute truth. We can only hold relativistic truth. Right? I mean, that's what Einstein showed us, amongst others. And what Rambam showed us, I would argue, amongst others. So in that sense, God is the word we use for the totality that is separate or different than the sum. But not in any ways something that can bring change to our lives or intervene, or to me, going back to Rory's comment, that's creating God in our own image. It's as the Kotzker Rebbe would say, idolatry of the mind.
All right, Bennett, do you want to take a crack before I say something, or?
I think I'll wait until I introduce the text I wanted to share today, because they actually serve in a way to answer the very question you're asking. So I'll defer till after you're finished.
All right. So I'll just add that for me, I very much believe in a personal God, that God has the wherewithal to intervene in human history, but God chooses, and by the way, the notion of the eclipsing of God, not necessarily the Buberian notion, but there's a book by Friedman that was called originally The Eclipse of God, and then there was changed the title for a whole host of reasons. But the book suggests, Roy, what I think you were talking about is that God grows over the course of time to appreciate that if God is going to truly be a good parent, God has to remove God's self from engagement and involvement in the world in a direct way to allow for there to be space for the growth of humanity. Yeah, and I think on some level that's already what you've indicated. So when I ask myself the question, can God create the rock that God cannot lift? Right? The answer is, of course, God can do that, but God chooses, right? If God chooses to do so, right? And so on some level, I do believe in the God who erupts from time to time into human history. And I have examples of that in my own life, and maybe we'll leave that for down the road for those conversations about the moments when God is not hidden and not eclipsed, but rather erupts. And I think we could each, if we really take the time to think about it, see those moments as much as sort of in a philosophical, theoretical framework. We want to become rationalistic, right? But ultimately, when you're waiting for your test results, isn't that the moment that you hope and pray that God will erupt into human history? When you're waiting for your child to recover from surgery or from an illness, as we listen outside their room to make sure that they're breathing, particularly during this crazy time of COVID when breath is so precious, are we not? So I want to believe, and I do believe in that kind of God.
Going back to our shared beloved teacher, David Hartman of a blessed memory, who, in some profound ways is the one who convenes this chevra here. I have such vivid memories of David Hartman as he knew he was dying and as he was struggling and declining, being at the Machon in Jerusalem and expressing clearly the pain at not having a personal God to be with him. That he had this I get the sense that he looked at God somewhat similarly to how I do, at least I like to think that. And that it left him with a God who wasn't there and didn't intervene and couldn't be of comfort to him during moments like that. And it always
But Daniel, I will say to you that, having visited Hartman near the end of his life, I asked him, is he going to say Shema when he knows the moment is coming? And the answer, of course, was, of course, yes, of course I'm going to say the Shema. Now, the question is, how do you square that particular circle? I don't know, but I appreciate what it is that you're saying. And so maybe I make the conscious choice to say that I want to believe in that personal God because I want to believe that there will be some answer from the other side and not silence.
For fear of trivializing this very important and very personal conversation, I just want to call to mind the words of our colleague and some of our teacher, Rabbi Lawrence Kushner, who in some of his writings speaks really beautifully and in a very accessible manner about the difference between belief, philosophical belief in God, and the experiential relationship or the experience of God. He says we ask the wrong question when we ask, do you believe in God? Perhaps the better question, the more useful question, not the right question, but the more useful question is for us to ask, when do you feel closest to God? And how do you experience God when you do feel close? And similarly, and a little more frighteningly, and Elisha Ben Abuya is an example of somebody who justifies the frightening nature of this. When do you feel less close to God? Or even when do you feel the need to deny God or to push God away? And for me, at least, that understanding really was an awakening that you can have somebody like Rabbi Hartman of blessed memory, Rabbi David Hartman of blessed memory, who simultaneously said, I feel very distant from belief in God, and nonetheless, I feel close enough to the God that I have trouble believing in that I want to recite Shema on my deathbed, for example, or, and we can use dozens, countless of other examples. And I think if I could say anything to all those that are with us today and to ourselves, that we make a mistake when we make this a binary choice between belief or non-belief. And it maybe is more useful to simply talk about experience. We all have those moments, those life and death, those tragic or those joyful moments when we have no doubt that we believe and we feel close. And I think if we're honest, most of us also have those moments when we feel very distant and maybe even in denial. And no, there is no God. I don't want to believe in God. I can't believe in God.
Maybe it would also help to define the God that we do or do not believe in that moment in time, right? And I think that will be a helpful part of this process as well. Maybe just because of the sake of time, we should go on to the next text that may help us a little bit in the process of defining what that God may or may not look like.
Rory, are you okay with moving on? Okay, so Autumn, Autumn, if you could put up the text from Maimonides first, if you have that available. If not, I could share it from my, there it comes. Thank you, Autumn. So I want to say by way of introduction, before we read these two texts, that I approach very much this conversation the way I just alluded to, that the question is very appealing from an intellectual, abstract point of view of, do I believe in God? And if so, what God? And what are my proofs for or my denials of God? And I personally was drawn very deeply to philosophy as a student and continue to be throughout my life drawn deeply to philosophy. But I discovered in my very encounter with philosophy answers to the question that was posed to us today, which is, what texts have most informed my understanding of God and my behavior vis-a-vis my understanding of God? And I'm bringing these two texts not because they are the most powerful theological texts for me, but they are theological texts. I do want to say really briefly, Rory, I loved that you brought the text from the Talmud about Elisha ben Abuya, Acher, in large part because I actually think he has never been given fair recognition in Jewish communal life for having a legitimate point of view. He was easily condemned by our predecessors. And actually his view is very much legitimate, whether we like it or not, and many people don't. But what I think I'm about to try and share in as quick a brief momentary encounter as I can are two examples of thinkers, much more recent than the Talmud, who offer us insights that might make this harder or they might make it easier, depending on where we go with it. The first, of course, is Rambam.
Rabbi Bennett, I'm sorry to interrupt, just to mention that I think Rabbi Bogart put into the chat As a Driven Leaf, which I think would be a wonderful book for everybody to read, particularly if you're interested in Elisha ben Abuya, and get a little bit into the complexities of who Elisha ben Abuya was in a historical, fictional kind of way. But I think it's a classic book and worthwhile, because the chat's going so quickly that people may miss it. So I apologize.
No, I'm glad you brought it back in. I'll say As a Driven Leaf was one of the most influential, formative things I read as a teenager that actually caused me to admire, despite the controversy, to admire Elisha ben Abuya and to actually decide to enter this work and to become a rabbi because of As a Driven Leaf. So I strongly echo your recommendation. Anyway, I want to very quickly read one little text from Rabbi Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, from his Shmona Prakim, his 8 chapters, which is an introduction that he wrote in the 12th century to Pirkei Avot, to the ethics of our fathers, the Mishnah that is called Pirkei Avot, in which he presents all sorts of incredible, powerful ideas. And he says, these are not just my ideas. These are thoughts that I've gleaned that somewhat randomly and quite systematically express Jewish theological ideas. I like this particular text because it is very concise. So I'm just going to read it, briefly talk about it, and then you'll know everything you need to know about Rambam, and we can move on. So the Rambam says in 8 chapters in this particular text, he says, "It has also become clear in metaphysics that by our intellects, we are unable to attain perfect comprehension of God's existence. May God be exalted. This," he goes on to say, "is due to the perfection of God's existence and the deficiency of our intellects. God's existence has no causes by which God could be known." And then he concludes this little section. It therefore follows that we do not know God's knowledge either, nor do we comprehend it in any way. Since God is God's knowledge, and God's knowledge is God. I'm going to say very little about this text. I hope that we understand, at least on some introductory level. Many of you may already know about Maimonides. This is what is known in philosophical teaching as Maimonides' theory of negative attributes of God. In essence, what the Rambam is saying here is, stop struggling to understand God, you mere mortals. Human beings are incapable, because of the limits of our human intellect, of truly understanding God, because God is what is not human. God is what is not physical. God is what is not us. God is everything other. And only God is God. Only God can know God. And all we as human beings are capable of knowing is not what God is, but only what God is not. We can draw boundaries around God. We can limit what God is not. We can only understand what he calls the negative attributes, the things God isn't. This does not answer the question, of course, of what is God or what do I believe about God, but it does perhaps offer some very small consolation or comfort, perhaps, to those of us who struggle so mightily to try and understand God. And I think the Rambam sets us on a path which, at least for me personally, has worked in my own life. And that's what led me to share today the second text that we see before us. So I want to just jump to that. Among the many theologians and thinkers who have offered me insight is the great philosopher and teacher of the 20th century, Martin Buber. Martin Buber, of course, in his most famous work, I and Thou, written in German and translated into English as I and Thou, differentiates between most of human experience, which he calls the I-it relationship, the objective relationship between us and the world and everything in the world and each other, that our day-to-day interactions are I-it. I relate to everything as an objective entity. But Buber teaches that there is one thing, one being, which he refers to as the eternal thou, which is different. And just as Maimonides taught centuries earlier through this idea of negative attributes, Martin Buber says, and here I've drawn this small quote from I and Thou, his book, he says, the eternal thou can by its nature not become it. It is the one thing that God, the eternal thou, is the one thing that is not it. For by its nature, it cannot be established in measure and bounds, not even in the measure of the immeasurable or the bounds of boundless being. For by its nature, it cannot be understood as a sum of qualities, not even as an infinite sum of qualities raised to a transcendental level. For it can be found neither in nor out of the world, for it cannot be experienced or thought. For we miss him, the language was gendered language, we miss God, God who is, if we say, I believe that God is also a metaphor, but thou is not. The eternal thou, this idea that we are incapable of understanding, is not a metaphor. It is real, Buber hints. It is simply incomprehensible. We can only get close by experiencing everything and everyone in the universe through what Buber calls meeting, or what we might call dialogue or relationship. And in this last quote, he elaborates, meeting with God does not come to us, to man, in order that he may concern himself with God, but in order that he may confirm that there is meaning in the world. I'd like to just summarize, and you can take the text off the page now, Autumn. Thank you so much. I just want to summarize and then throw it to conversation and discussion. To me, this was like an explosive understanding of theology. When I was studying philosophy and theology, and in the process of beginning to grapple seriously with my own understanding of and relationship with God, and what Hermann Cohen, the great German philosopher in the 19th century, called the God idea, Buber, building upon the Rambam, exploded my ability to understand that the very fact that God is difficult to encounter, the very fact that God is almost impossible to describe or explain, is precisely confirmation for me that even though I can't describe it, there is a God, and I do have a relationship with God, and I am striving to experience that relationship, but it's not, ironically, by going deeper into faith and God. It's, as Rory, as you said a few minutes ago, it's by going out and being in relationship with each other and with the world around us. That is meeting with God. It's the best we can do. It's the closest we can come. And when people ask, so how do I know God? How do I understand God? For me, the Buberian answer, the Maimonidean answer, the authentic Jewish answer is look into the mirror and look into the eyes of the other and look at the beauty of the world and dive into the real relationships we have, because they will ultimately lead us closer and closer to the ineffable, the unknowable, but nonetheless very, very real, divine, the eternal thou. So I'll throw it to you all to react. Those are my texts. To answer the question, Carney, that you posed us for this session, those are the texts that kind of explain how I try and answer this question.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. I want to go just back to the Rambam for a moment. Autumn took it down, but if we could put it up for one more second, I want to ask you to kind of clarify one particular piece about the metaphysics that's there. It's so Maimonidean, right? But if Autumn, we can put it up for just a second. Because clearly what the Rambam is saying is under normal circumstances, most things can be understood if you're smart enough, wise enough, educated enough through metaphysics, right? Right. In metaphysics, that by our intellects, we are unable to attain perfect comprehension of God. In other words, you would think that if you had the right tool, which according to the Rambam under normal circumstances, right, would be metaphysics, because that's the ultimate place that you can go to. I just want to remind us that there is a place beyond metaphysics, right? And at least in the teaching of the Rambam, and that's nevuah, that's prophecy.
Prophecy. Yeah.
Right. And so I want to make sure to throw that element out there, because part of at least my conception of God, and wonder what you think here as well, is can we account for the phenomenon of not we are prophets, but that we have moments of clarity that are prophetic? I wouldn't want to claim that I was a prophet, but I would surely like to claim that we each have moments of prophetic insight that give us the opportunity, not through metaphysics. It's not an intellectual exercise, which I understand. The Rambam could have got rid of his body and just been a brain, right? The Rambam would have been just a brain. But we aren't just the brain. We are a combination of many elements, including an neshama, a soul, which animates us and allows us to somehow or another feel a soul connection. And maybe that's what you're saying Buber is suggesting here. I think it'll come out through some of our conversation as well, and maybe some of the other teachings. But I just want to account for that there is something in this entire enterprise that's far beyond the realm of the metaphysics of the Rambam, and Rambam self even knows that.
Yes, thank you, Carney. And Autumn, I think you could take the text back down so we can see everyone. Thank you, Carney, for sharing that. I mean, I don't want to take the time for us to teach a class on Rambam, which you all could teach far better than I, but the idea of the intellectual capacity of the very few being capable, of course, the Rambam referring to himself, there are certain people who are capable of doing this work, but there is an implied humility here that, no matter how much you study, science, philosophy, whatever, most human beings are incapable. And yes, there is that idea of nevuah, that idea that there is prophecy, there is encounter with God. But as I think it was Sarah who typed into the chat a moment ago, the rest of us have plenty, and this isn't condescending on Rambam's part. The rest of us have lots of work to do. We've got a lot of, maybe it was condescending, I'm not sure, but that for better or for worse, the rest of us, all of us mere mortals, we got plenty of work to do with our hearts and our hands and our abilities to make the world better, to be in dialogue, to be in relationship. And that too brings us closer in Buber's metaphoric way to an understanding of the eternal thou. I come to know God better when I go feed the hungry. It's not just feeding the hungry. That actually gets me closer to the eternal thou.
But don't we also see in Buber something else? Don't we see in Buber saying, if you really look and see the other with a small o, you will encounter then the other. I don't think it's only about acts of kindness and chesed and feeding. I think that Buber is saying something very different, right? Or something beyond. He's actually saying that you're going to see the transcendent, right? Not in some place that is transcendent, but in that which is very much based here in this reality. And that if you really own seeing this, you'll see a glimpse thereof of the other. Right? That's the way at least the way I read, and I can see you shaking your head in the affirmative, so you agree with me, and I want to hear what Rabbi Daniel and Rory have to say, but for me, that actually on some level negates what I think the Rambam is saying. I want to read the Rambam as a little bit of an intellectual snob. I think the Rambam, in this text is talking to the average individual, right? And I think the Rambam kind of lowers what I think our capabilities are of apprehension and comprehension in modalities that are beyond the realm of the head, the intellect. I want to talk about the encounter with the divine, right? Of the other here, that real encounter, that I, thou, was something that may be really, truly ineffable, non-describable in words. And you know what? Be damned, metaphysics. People feel the right thing to do, the right thing to be, feel transcendent, simply because they're made up of elements that allow for them to have those kinds of spiritual nerve endings. And I don't want to downplay that, because of what I think when we downplay that, there is no yearning for aspiration to be better. It puts a roof, a ceiling, caps our capabilities in the realms that the Rambam wants to say are the normal realms of everybody, except the Yechidei Skula, the very few who can be prophets. I find that to be troubling, disturbing intellectual snobbery. And by the way, for me at least, not helpful for people. I always want to say to somebody that if you haven't felt it yet, adayin yesh zman, there's still time for you to feel that place of transcendence as well, and a connection or a glimpse of the Almighty. So I've said enough on that, but Rabbi Daniel was going to say something.
I'm struck, Carney, listening to you talk about Rambam, that, right, like, I don't think it's an accident that his son becomes a Jewish Sufi mystic, right? Like, and in so many ways goes in the other direction, his teenage rebellion, I guess. I'm struck, Carney, to go back to something else you said Rambam sees something higher than metaphysics. And in my head, I said, yeah, theoretical physics. In the sense that I always read Rambam's notion of nevuah, of prophecy, as essentially being Einstein sitting alone in his room coming up with relativity. And, the debate that I have had over and over again with Micha Goodman, our teacher, all of our teachers on Rambam, is if Rambam would have looked at Einstein sitting there and said, this is what I mean by prophecy, then would he have still told Einstein that he needed to stop eating bacon? Right? Like, if he'd already gotten there, was there any point in the mitzvahs that Rambam so often talks about as being pedagogical in nature, right? As teaching us and getting us along the ladder rather than having ultimate value themselves. So yeah, I don't know if we want to jump into those waters, but that's how I've always read Rambam.
I want to say that I think the Rambam actually is the greatest mystic of all time. Actually, I read Rambam very, very, very differently than that. And I think, my problems with the Rambam are that the Rambam wanted to believe that there was the Rambam and a few other, Nevi'im, right? And that scares me, that worries me. On some level, I love what Buber does, because Buber starts the process of making it palatable and available to people, right? And it gives some steps along the way, as Rabbi Jim said, right? Some possibilities of ways in which one can encounter through really seeing people and through doing acts of chesed and to, imitating God on some level, right? The imitatio Dei, through doing what God does, right? Feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and all those things. I get it, right? But you have to see that first, right? You have to see that there's a need there. That starts the process, but it doesn't end the process either. And I think the same thing is true. These are all starters for me, right? Like soup starters. It's all soup starters for a spirituality that is transcendent.
So I'm not going to debate. I don't claim to understand Rambam enough to sort of but I'm struck, and Jim, thank you for bringing these texts. And I'm struck also. I keep thinking about, because I've been studying with a group, the Book of Ruth, and I always love, right? Like in the Book of Ruth, there's when Boaz first goes out to the field, right? Like the way that he greets people is he says, Hashem imachem, like God is with you. And we just had this this incredible discussion of what does it mean to walk through the world if that's how you greet people, if that's how you see people. And even in what we say now, right? We say Shalom Aleichem, right? Like peace be upon you. But I mean, Shalom is also another name of God. And just, I think to what you're saying, and Jim, it's very much, I think, also reflects my own views of it. But maybe you're saying this, and maybe, or maybe I'm making a distinction. I'm not even totally certain, right? I think it's not just that we access God through a better understanding of the other. It's that actually God is in the other, right? If we actually see, right? If God is in us and God is everywhere, right? If that's actually where we find God, which I think is also, some people have said, is this a distinction? And I'm not going to speak about other faith traditions, but I do think that there are some theologies where if your only goal in life is to understand God, that you're going to, first of all, right, I think the rabbis make very clear that they do not think that God wants you to become an ascetic and leave the world and be absent from the world to become closer to God. That actually is not going to bring you into the right direction in terms of closeness with God. But also that, if you're harmful to the world or harmful to people in your pursuit of God, then right, you've missed the whole point, because you've actually left God behind, right? If I'm willing to knock this person aside. And so, I'm always struck by that. And I think to the point also you're making, Jim, I don't think I'm there. I don't think I'm there at all. But I think in terms of what I'm striving to get to? Like, what does it mean to actually go through the world to say, this person also is God, right? Like, not a God, right? But like that there is not just that this person has an element of God, but actually, right? Like, if we're all created in the image of God and we all have a piece of God, then I can understand the totality of God better the more I understand the totality of people. But also, like, so it's not that it's a path to God, but actually, like, it is a piece of God, and that becomes right. So it's not. I would say, like, it's not the start to the end goal. Like, that actually can be a goal in and of itself.
Beautiful. Thank you all. This is really, I mean, we could do this for a really, really long time. We'd start with metaphysics and then go from there. Rabbi Bogart, I think you should go up. We're a little bit sensitive about the time, right? We have about 25 minutes left. Is that right? And we've got 2 texts to cover. So
I've got a
Thank
short
you.
text.
I've got a short attention span, so we're in good shape.
You see this? Can you all see this?
It says that you're screen sharing, but it hasn't loaded for me. Oh, now I see it.
I've got some sort of message saying Zoom is quitting unexpectedly, but you can see me. So, and you can see the text. So we're just going to pretend like it didn't say that message. Great. I love this text. Also comes from Buber, though it's just an anthology of texts, of Hasidic texts that he collects. Tales of the Hasidim.
Oh, never say the word just. Never say the word just. Yeah.
I meant in the sense that these are not his original stories. Yeah.
But they're verteidigt and verbessert by him, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Reworked by him.
So about the Chassid of the Rebbe of Kutsk, the Kutzker Rebbe, who is one of the great, I think, doubters of Jewish tradition, in the most wonderful of way, in the way that doubt and faith are not opposites, but can really be the same thing sometimes. So Chassid, one of the students of the Rebbe of Kutsk, comes to the Kutzker Rebbe and says, "Rabbi, I keep brooding and I don't seem to be able to stop." "What do you brood about?" asked the Rebbe. "I keep brooding about whether there really is a judgment and really is a judge, meaning I keep brooding about whether there really is God. What does it matter to you?" "Rabbi, if there's no judgment and no judge, then what does all creation mean?" "What does it matter to you?" says the Rabbi. "Rabbi, if there's no judgment and no judge, then what do the words of Torah mean?" "What does that matter to you?" "Rabbi, what does it matter to me? What does the Rabbi think? What else could matter to me?" "Well," said the Rabbi of Kutsk, "if it matters to you all that much, then you are a good Jew after all. And it is quite all right for a good Jew to brood. Nothing can go wrong with them." I love this text. I really love this text. I love the humor in the text. I love the honesty and the wisdom in the text. But I also love what feels very Jewish to me, which is that unlike what I think of as being faiths, and I would put Christianity and Islam in these faiths, where to be a part of that community means to believe. I think to be a Jew means to engage and to struggle and to tell this story and engage with it. And I think that's an incredibly different thing. I think it actually means that, right, in terms of sociological categories, I don't think that Jews are the same thing as Christians and Muslims. I actually think when we gather together for Abrahamic faith conferences, we're not gathering in the same footing, because I think we're actually something different than Muslims and Christians, even as many particularly white evangelical Christians would be quite upset to hear something said like that. And so I adore this poem of the Kutzker Rebbe. The struggle is the point, and being a part of this conversation is the point. And I don't just mean this conversation. I certainly don't mean the conversation here today, but I don't even mean the conversation of this generation, right? Like, to me, that's what Torah is it's this chain of conversation with the past and with the future about how we live our lives and what our values should be. And God is a part of that conversation, and to struggle with that concept is a part of what it means to be a Jew. But to accept any individual definition of that concept, I think, to me, becomes idolatry. Which is to say, as our I think it was Melilla who says this, that faith is a part, doubt is a part of faith, and it has to be. for it to be Jewish. So love this short little story. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on this.
I first of all, it's so perfectly articulated, and also, I mean, the piece about doubt, right? Just that I think so often we as humans, like I don't even necessarily mean as Jews, like we're somehow led to believe that those pieces are somehow moral failures, right? That like doubt means, right? Or like people feel like the doubt is first of all, like I love, like I don't know, I was thinking about, Jim, when you pulled together, there was a the retreat that you had with evangelical pastors and with imams, and we were there, and so at one point, I don't even remember why, but like I was giving like a little teaching, like you guys voted me, and I did this teaching, and I don't know, it was like somehow about arguing with God. And I remember like the imams coming over afterwards, and they were like, we're so confused. And I was like, that's great. Like, that's a totally Jewish thing. Like, I'm good with that. And then they was like, so do you believe in God? And I said, yeah. And they're like, but you're arguing with God. And I was like, well, you can't argue with what you don't believe in. Like, I don't, like, it was such a different concept. And, just this idea also that like, any relationship you're in, you're not like, it's not like you're like 100%, always thinking about this other person, or like, you're always feeling like deeply in love, or like we fluctuate in relationships, and we have to work on relationships. And that's not a failure. Like, that's what it is to be in real relationship. And, I think the doubt and frustration and anger and joy and happy, like all of those are the emotions of it. And the idea that like it's the journey, like it's the journey, and that's actually the key.
I just want to put an exclamation point on what both you and Daniel just said. I also want to just be a little contrary for the sake of being contrary for just a moment. I think there's a difference between what you, Daniel, referred to as the differentness or the otherness of Jewish faith, in contrast to the faith of other religious communities and beliefs. There's a difference between that, which makes me personally feel very uncomfortable, actually, than saying these are not faith muscles or abilities that have been exercised or have been permitted to be exercised by people of other communities, the same as perhaps the Jewish community has done. I would not want us to, personally, I would not want us to suggest that doubt, for example, or questioning are forbidden by or antithetical to Islam or Christianity. Quite the contrary. It may be that the institution.
Let me clarify then, because that is not what I was saying at all. What I am saying is that sociologically, I don't think we are a religious community, and I think they are, in the sense that faith is the center of what it means for the vast majority of the Christian world and the Muslim world, and it is the organizing principle around which people come together. And I do not believe that to be the case for us, right? I think tribe and peoplehood is the center for us, and that Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people, but that actually you don't have to be a practicer of Judaism to be Jewish. And that is what I mean. I'm not even a little bit suggesting anything about the role of doubt in those other communities, but instead saying that I don't believe that religion or faith is the right sociological category to think of Jews within.
Maybe
even as the classical reformers would disagree with me.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. So thank you for that clarification.
And maybe it's a great way to introduce Abraham Joshua Heschel, who will be the last text. How's that for a good segue, huh? All those years in the rabbinate. But I want to say actually that I think Heschel often found relationships with other people of faith to be much more inspiring than his relationship with the Jewish community. And in part, Daniel, I think, contrary to what you just said, because their faith was real and palatable, and that their faith was actually at the center of who they were as opposed to peripheral, right? And maybe this is one of the distinctions between Heschel and others in the way in which Heschel went about doing what Heschel was doing. Heschel would talk about the fact that he wished that synagogues would become more like Black churches, right? He wished we could feel the Spirit in the way in which he was experiencing the Spirit. He often talked about this in some of his lectures, which, by the way, he gave, to groups of rabbis, be they Reform rabbis or conservative rabbis or anybody who would come to hear him in synagogues, chastising synagogues, right? Amongst rabbis, chastising rabbis for having become functionaries or looking at Judaism from some kind of sociological, anthropological way, rather than from a faith orientation. Right, the kind of separation of church and state drove him absolutely crazy. He wanted to infuse religion into the life of everything, or spirit into the life of everything. So maybe it's in that context that we could put up, Autumn, the text from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and that'll be the final text for today, and then we'll give some opportunity for questions about this and other things. I want to talk about divine pathos, which is far more complicated as a term than it is to understand what it's all about, as are the writings of Abraham Joshua Heschel. So I'm going to start with a section that says man's or human's relevance to God, which in and of itself is consequential, right? Meaning that we have some place in this drama called existence, and we are important to the Almighty. It's not that only that the Almighty is important to us, but we are important to God. The theology of pathos, sorry, I've just got to close this because the comments go on top of it. Whoops. The theology of pathos brings about a shift in the understanding of man's ultimate problems. The prophet does not see the human situation in and by itself. The predicament of the human is a predicament of God. Anochi imo bitzara. God is in it with us, right? Who has a stake in the human situation. God is impacted. God is going through this experience. Probably the best, I think, for us as rabbis, the best example of that is that, right, that the Shekhinah, the divine presence of God, is in Galut, is in exile with us, right? That God's self has been exiled. Sin, guilt, suffering cannot be separated from the divine situation. The life of sin is more than a failure of man. It's a frustration of God. When God peeks down, right, metaphorically from the heavens, or and maybe not so metaphorically from the heavens, and looks down at the situation and sees that God's creations are not living in the way in which God intended for them to live, what happens? God becomes frustrated, right? God looks down. Why? Because God and humanity are partners, are going through this experience together, and one partner is not fulfilling his responsibility. The life of sin is more than a failure of man, it's a frustration of God. Thus, man's alienation from God is not the ultimate fact by which to measure man's situation. The divine pathos, the fact of God's participation in the predicament of man, is the elemental fact. The essential meaning of pathos is, therefore, not to be seen in its psychological denotation as stated from a state of the soul, got to go down, but in a little more, but in the theological connotation, signifying God as involved in history. God is involved in history. He is engaged to Israel and has a stake in its destiny. The profundity of this insight can be sensed only in the light of the prophets' awarenesses of the mystery and transcendence of God. By the way, this comes from the prophets. This is Heschel's original doctoral dissertation, which later comes out in the early 60s in 2 volumes, then put into 1 volume, but 2 distinct volumes, talking about the notion of what? Here we are again at the realm of prophecy, Nevuah, as the possibility that all can experience what? The notion that God is with us in this experience that we are going through. The profundity of this insight can be sensed only in the light of the prophet's awareness of the mystery and transcendence of God. For the biblical understanding of history, the idea of pathos is essential as an idea of man being an image of God, for it is an understanding of creation. The biblical writers were aware of the paradox involved in God's relation to man. Behold, to the Lord your God, belong heaven and earth. Hashamayim shamayim lashem. The earth with all that is in it. Yet the Lord set his heart in love upon your fathers and chose their descendants after them. You are above all peoples, as is said that day. And I'm sure this is going to cause us a little bit of consternation, but I don't think that Heschel really meant the Jewish people here. I think he means all of humanity, or all people who buy into the notion that God is involved in history. Never in history has man been taken as seriously as in prophetic thinking. The prophets took it very seriously. Man is not only an image of God, he is a perpetual concern of God. God is with us through all of this. As we suffer, God suffers. As we celebrate, God celebrates. The idea of pathos adds a new dimension to human existence. Whatever a man does affects not only his own life, but also the life of God insofar as it is directed to man. The import of man raises him beyond the level of mere creature. He is a consort, a lover, a partner, a factor in the life of God. And of course, all of us know that Heschel, being from the Hasidic and mystical tradition, right, this is the whole notion of the kind of the ability for hitorut deletata, right? That God's self is influenced by what happens down here, right? There is this kind of sympathetic magic that happens, often described in that way. We shake the lulav here and things happen above. We put on tefillin here and something happens above, right? There is that mirror. But I think this is Heschel talking about this nature of this relationship. And so that if God is going to be God, it's only through us acknowledging that we are in this process with God, and us acknowledging that we are impacting what will be in the world at large. And so this divine pathos is a very powerful idea for me. Why? Because it says to me that if you want to make a difference in the world, we'll be back to this again, ma'asim. It is Maasim Tovim. It is the notion of mitzvot, which our teacher, Arnie Eisen, wrote a tremendous amount about reflecting on Heschel. That the way in which to impact in a positive way in the world is becoming shutafim, partners with God, in creating the world that God originally intended the world to be. And so I want to suggest that divine pathos, at least for me, and the real question for all of us was, how does this inform the work? When somebody comes to me and says to me, I'm just not feeling God's presence, I go, you know what, do me a favor, go feed the hungry, go clothe the naked, go out there and watch, because all of us as rabbis, we have this great privilege, right? To see that Maaseh Yadenu, the work of our hands, is actually work that uplifts people and gives them a sense that there is something greater than themselves in the world, and that there is hope always, right? That there is, it's not a world that's cold. One of the ways in which we can talk about this is, we often talk since Rabbi Bennett talked about his love of, of talking about philosophy, right? In philosophy, particularly Greek philosophy, we have the notion of what? The mover who's unmoved, right? The unmoved mover. For Heschel, it's not the unmoved mover, it's the most moved mover, right? The most moved mover. God is impacted, affected. And I can almost imagine, right, that sometimes God looks down from the heavens with, God's metaphorical hand, or maybe not so metaphorical hand, on God's head, right? Kind of like, and the tears are rolling down, saying, what's going on there with my children? And therefore, what's going on to me as the God of the universe and the universe that I created, because you are not being the shutafim, the partners in making the world what it needs to be. So for me, Heschel becomes a tremendous motivator to understand that I might not understand philosophically all the natures of God, but what I do understand is that the work that I do in the world has an impact not only on me and the people around me, but it's so powerful and so consequential that it actually impacts on the divine as well. And to let God down, letting down, it's almost as bad as letting down your kids, right? Like, you don't want to let down the Almighty. And so therefore we have to engage and involve ourselves in the Maasim Tovim, whatever way we want to define those Maasim Tovim. I mean, I'm sure we would agree on many of them. But in that way, we are engaged and involved as movers along with the most moved mover, which is the Almighty. So that helps me.
I just want to pull out a Thank you, Carney. I want to pull out a line from Bob Sparks that he just shared in the chat that I think
Yeah.
only panelists can see. He notes, of the four of you, Carney seems to have the most personal and emotional God. And just wanted to hear if that resonated with you all too.
And human God, isn't that interesting?
Huh.
He and then adds at the end, and human God. At least I see that here.
Yeah, I missed that line. Yeah.
And by the way, that's why I was maybe pushing back a little bit. I don't want to believe in a God that's out there far away. That's what scares me about that reading of the Rambam. Rambam got up every morning, put on his talis tefillin, and davened, right? And I'm sure that the Rambam wasn't learning during davening, right? The Rambam was davening during davening. Because I hate that image of the Rambam as a brain without a body or without a soul. I don't want that image because I don't think it's. And here's the key, right? All of this is, how does this inform our rabbinates, the way in which we teach? I don't think that's appealing to people. I think people don't only want head, they really want heart. And they don't only want head and heart, they want neshama. They want something transcendent. And at least that's what I'm hearing. And maybe you have different experiences than I do. Yeah, we just have to be, jacks of all trade, and to know that when someone sits in front of us, there are people who are going to want the intellectual, there are people going to want the spiritual, there are people who want the emotional. But thank God we have this amazing treasure chest, this toolbox that we can reach into and utilize depending on tzarchei sha'ah, the needs of a particular moment in time.
Yes, I think that's beautiful, and I appreciate it, and I value it a lot. I would just say my own answer quickly, as time is getting late, is that it is not an either or proposition. I find great personal meaning in and value to the intellectual journey into faith, just as much as I do the very personal and very real encounter with God. And as I said earlier, there are times in my life when I have a very personal feeling about and relationship to God, many of which are very deeply tied to pathos, but also the opposite of pathos, to great joy and celebration. I had no doubt in my life, as I witnessed the birth of my children, that God was present, as I had no doubt of God's, of my difficulties in faith and my absence and distance from God as I sat with my mother as she was dying, and everything in between. And I don't think it's as simple as Bob's question of, is one of us more close to God or less close, or more personal or less personal? I think that being on this journey of faith, whether through science, through intellectual work, through prayer, through mitzvot, through work in the world, all of these things, and that's why I love this opportunity to be together, is that it's yes and not either or.
I just want to add, because I don't feel, there's diversity here, but I don't think it's there's not like a clear spectrum that we're going to put it on. And I also think that if you asked us all in 3 months, we also could give you different answers. And that's also part of, I think, the beauty is that there doesn't have to be any simple answers to this. I know for me, like, the God that I have is a very personal and very close one. It's not a distant one, even as it's a God that I don't have like a personal intervention in the same sort of way. But what I also want to note is that what strikes me is that even as we've all come in very different places and on very different paths, personally and through the text that we've brought today, what struck me is that I think what I've taken from every single one of what each of us have shared is a deep, deep connection to other people. And I think it's really interesting that that's also, and maybe that's part of like the choices we've made of the careers that we have. But I think even as like we've brought different texts and our journeys have been vastly different, that has been the unifying force, is that for every one of us, it calls upon us in terms of how we have to act in the world and the ways that we need to be in community with other people.
I think that's beautiful. And I think that's really the unifying principle. And by the way, I just want to say it again. We didn't really mention the Hartman Institute directly, but I think in many ways, that's the Torah that we have all taken away from that experience. All of us walked away from the Hartman experience feeling closer to our colleagues, and and therefore closer to our Torah and closer to our God. And I want to thank the Hartman Institute. And I think it takes time, a little bit, at least for me, to be away from something to appreciate how much you kind of miss it, or to appreciate the lessons as they've seeped into your being. Because, and by the way, therefore for me, and I'm sure for others of us, we try then to bring that orientation to the work that we're doing in our individual congregations and community. Right? If only we could, right, replicate what it is that each of us received in that experience directly, and then how we refracted it through our own individual prisms, and then how we're sharing it in the world at large. That means that that Torah has grown so exponentially, right? That notion of God, that notion of Israel, that notion, all of those things have grown because we had an opportunity to have new and wonderful and old and wonderful materials, right? We refracted it, and now we're sharing it and processing it together. And for me, this is really an outstanding opportunity. So I want to thank us all, and I just want to make sure to thank the Machon, the Hartman Institute, and I know we're going to continue to have a deep, deep relationship with the Hartman Institute going forward. Speaking of which, the next time we get together, Maharat Rory, this is usually your role. I don't want to step in. You got the hat on, so you might as well go and give it to us. So the next time we get together is going to be
You're queuing me up here. You're
the
doing
next
so well.
February.
I think February 8th is the second.
February 8th, yeah.
February 8th, Bezrat Hashem. With the help of God, we will get together. And our topic for the next time, we've done Torah, we've done God, and of course the third in that wonderful trifecta is Israel. But I think we're going to go at it at a slightly different kind of orientation. And I personally am very excited for that conversation as well, and hope that the sparks will fly, and they'll fly ever inward and upward.
As long as Bob Sparks is with us on our call.
Oh, there you go. That really sparked something good. Fantastic. Okay.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful
Thanks,
week.
everyone.
And hope you're all staying well and safe and warm and healthy.
Amen. Amen.